Welcome to Faithful Deconstruction. I'm Jessie Cruickshank.
And I am Rowland Smith.
And we are going to talk today and have a conversation about the role of community and kind of share a little bit of our own stories of deconstruction. In the last episode, we heard from Greg and we heard about how he had deconstructed the way he thought about church and just that fantastic and interesting and painful journey of just changing it all up and realizing that the things that he held most dear weren't finding an expression and that maybe he had chosen some paths wrong or at least that there was a better way. And it's hard to kind of get over yourself a little bit. So you and I have both done that. Yeah. And I want to talk about that. But I want to take us back before we do to this very fascinating part about the Tower of Babel story. And that is that it's located in Genesis 11. And it is in the middle of the lineage of Shem. So Shem is one of the descendants of Noah, and so you have like the world repopulating, and it gives some of the lineage of Shem, and then it has the Tower of Babel in like this little vignette of 9 verses, and then it kind of repeats the lineage of Shem again, and takes that to Abraham. So by chapter 12, you have the call of Abraham, and you know, when I was sitting with the scriptures and just kind of letting them soak into me, and the Lord teach me, I was like, what is that about? Because I'm always interested in the order in which God does things. And when things are like, my editor would like change it, I'm like, what? So if God doesn't have a very good editor to make sure that they're not repeating themselves and things are in the right order, then there has to be purpose. So I'm always curious about the purpose. So what it says to me, and I'm interested what it says to you, because what it says to me is that, yes, the world is repopulating and the people are coming together, but then they get scattered. And it moves from that scattering into the beginning of the promise of reunification. So that, you know, we go to Abraham and then the covenant God made with Abraham and saying, okay, no, actually you're my people. You may be scattered across the world. You may have no common language. And this may have been the most disrupting thing, I mean, after the flood in a long time. Right. I don't even know the time frames. But the promise that desire for us not to be scattered and to belong to one another is actually the way God made us. And so we want to talk about community. And ultimately, I see that the beginning of the journey that ends with Jesus, and that Jesus is actually the thing that is the fulfillment of the promise of reunification. And that's kind of
unites us.
Yeah, it unites us, like Ephesians 4 talks about. But I mean, that's kind of how I hold that, but I'm interested in how you interpret that.
I definitely see the community aspects of that and the driving back to community. I think one of the most interesting things I would notice out of that is that they're never really apart from God's story. And so I think oftentimes when we deconstruct or we have doubts or, you know, we're leaving one community of faith and trying to figure out something else, or you've got Greg trying to change the ethos of his church or whatever, you almost feel like you're exiting God's story, and then you're merging back in with something new. But I really just wonder, I mean, you're always part of God's story. And I mean, whether deconstruction is caused by God, I mean, that's way above my pay grade. I don't know, but I know that he redeems things. And so I think wherever we are, what Babel kind of says to me is that there's this redemptive process back to community. He's always part of the story.
And that he never, we can't wander too far away from him. Like, he never just lets us go.
Right.
Like, he's always there trying to, redemption. I think that's the perfect word. You know, in my own deconstruction, it's that truth that I think has chased me. Even, you know, there was a part of my deconstruction where I did run away from God, but he didn't run away from me. I mean, I shared a little bit about the part of my deconstruction when we were talking, and but that was after a different season where I had run away, and so I knew he wasn't going to leave me, and he wasn't going to let me go. So even while I was sorting other things out with him, each time I deconstructed, it built upon each other, and I didn't lose the truths that I had earned or gained or really realized in the one beforehand. So, I mean, what about you? What is your thoughts about God changed as you've been through different seasons of deconstruction?
Well, I mean, I think I said this in episode 1, but where I was in my 20s, let's say, a new Christian, but in ministry, and having not grown up in the church, where I am now is very different. And even the way I think about whether it's theology, ecclesiology, missiology, all these components of, ministry and God's work in the world. But so I'm in a very, very different place. And we were talking earlier that, what I would say is that deconstruction has allowed me to have a more fulfilling faith now. I mean, my faith is more alive. It's freer to me. It's like it has less of a weight on my shoulders. It is definitely messier, but what I've been able to do is find a comfort in the messiness. I don't ask the same questions of the Bible. I don't ask the same questions of my church. My metrics and the way I view those things have changed, but it's given me more resonance in my relationship with God. I don't know if that makes sense. So at 60, I feel like I'm in the best place I've ever been in my faith. And I might say I have fewer answers about what does that really mean in the Bible? Was that historical or metaphorical? All those kinds of things. I think I have fewer answers for someone, but I feel like I know more about God than I ever did. So
because you've been through these processes and you've allowed God to reform your identity and teach you more about yourself and teach you more about Him, it led you to create this community that meets at your house. I mean, tell us a little bit about that, because we want to encourage people and create and be part of communities that hold us while we ask questions and maybe deconstruct and just journey with us. So what has that been like for you guys?
And I don't know if I created this community or if God created the community for me. It's it's just like anything like that. You're blessed by what you feel led to start, but it was during COVID and our neighborhood was in upheaval like neighborhoods around the country, and people couldn't meet in churches or small groups or those kinds of things. And I think at that time you could meet outside in groups of 10 or whatever the rule was. And so I went on this little thing called Nextdoor, which a lot of people have Nextdoor apps and stuff. And it's just a communication device for your city or neighborhood. If you have Nextdoor, you should go find it, because it's the best way to kind of live missionally into stuff. And I just put out an invitation. I said, hey, if you're a Christ follower and you're finding COVID and all these things, these tensions in your life, would anyone like to meet down at the park? We've got a park about 2 blocks away, and I'll bring coffee and we can just talk about, all this stuff that's going on in our lives and kind of get it off our chests and all that. And so, there were a few people that said yes. And so I came down here to our church community, made coffee, took it down to the park, and met some people, and met a couple of younger girls that told their whole story transparently. And it was, it was one of those deconstructive stories that was from kind of a church abuse structure. And out of that, one of them asked, are you going to do any more of those meetings or something like that? And so we put it together and started meeting on Monday nights, and some different friends started, hey, could I be part of that, or could I come to that? And we've had a couple of new members and an older couple that have started coming. And, it reminds me of some of the things you've said, where like in Babel, you can kind of imagine these people kind of getting blown out, from this community, and they're kind of wandering, looking for themselves, looking for who is like me,
Right,
and
yeah.
what part of the group am I part of now? And I think what it's done is it's helped just create a safe place for people to say, oh, there's some people like me, so they can enter into a discussion. And and I've been to seminary, I've done all this study and all this stuff, so I could easily try to take that over with, well, here's what you should believe, or here's what the Bible says, or here, whatever. And so I think what my deconstruction has helped me do is sit with people like that. And it's whether they're saying, I don't know if I believe in God anymore, to I really love Jesus and I hate the church, or I'm trying to figure out a way back into the church, whatever it is. I'm able to sit with all of those, and understand. And so it's been good for me in my continued journey. And I think it's helped give us space for safe conversation. And the fruit of it is there are some redemptive stories of people finding their way back into community. I mean, we heard that from Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
She's part of that group, and that was her first step back in. And now she's kind of, coming to a larger, worship gathering, which, that's not necessarily the goal. But I think what it points to is that she's saying, oh, I can be with the people of God. It's not necessarily like my old experience,
Right.
Yeah.
So finding the new community in the people who can be with you where you're at. I mean, is there anything from your past, from your own journey of deconstruction, that you remember and you tried, like was there anybody who journeyed with you well that you then try to model and do the same thing?
No, my own personal deconstruction was a quiet one because I was on church staffs where the kinds of things that I was, wondering and thinking about probably would have made me suspect, in the community that I was in. And I think the questions that I was asking were perhaps questions that other pastors and church leaders have thought, but also never felt freedom to discuss, And I think God can handle our doubts, but somehow we can't let God handle our, other people's doubts or our doubts. And so, there were podcasts I'd listen to or books I would read or, different things. And not growing up in the church, I didn't have a baggage or a tradition that held those things. And so I was kind of a freer thinker, But I think, there was a point in my story where we kind of left the church. We opened a coffee shop, planted a little missional community, and didn't think that we would go back into the institutional church. The staff that I'm on at the church I'm at now is a very different place, and we're really welcoming of different journeys and different ways of thinking. And so, or I probably wouldn't be on a church staff, if it weren't that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That reminds me of what Toby said, right? Where he was talking about being with people and just holding the space with them, understanding that there may be things of the old environment that are triggering,
right?
Whatever that past story is. And, so sometimes people change whole denominations, or they might go from being evangelical to being Orthodox, or from Catholic to, evangelical. Like we kind of change major theology streams because those are different experiences of church in profound ways. And Toby just, talking about creating a space that people could come into and they could have a conversation about Jesus without being distracted by all the things that they were working through.
And I love the way that they say in their community that we're guides, not gatekeepers.
Right.
And I think it's unfortunate, and I think it's true, and maybe unintentional, that like pastors in seminaries or whatever, they're kind of launched into ministry being taught you're the interpreter of everything for your church. And so it's your job to tell people what they should believe, Right,
because they're trained that orthodoxy or that agreement of belief is the thing that unites us.
It's the thing that unites us. Whereas now I think the journey toward Jesus is the thing that unites us.
Yeah.
And so, I think if we could just, if a lot of us as church leaders could just make that shift of, I'm here to help be a guide in a community. I mean, that's what God's called me to. That's why I did all the extra education or whatever, studied Greek or whatever, I'm just here to be a guide. Then as opposed to a gatekeeper, not only would people not be kind of pushed into deconstruction, but it would actually be freer to them in ministry as well. I think they would. It's messier, but I think it enlivens all the things that we're called to as ministers.
Yeah. I mean, I'm fortunate that in the first deconstruction space, I was in a church of gatekeepers, and it resulted in my whole family getting kicked out of the church. So in that first time, I mean, fortunately, my parents have always just taught us to have a deep relationship with God, and they haven't been dogmatic. And so my brother and my sister and I have never left our faith, even as we've been on a pretty amazing journey. But, so the first one, they were all gatekeepers. And being kicked out of church is like a really intense thing because you're trying to pursue Jesus, like that reason that you pursue Jesus out of the walls of the church, because they're sending you. But then in the second one, I was part of just this amazing faith community where everybody was guides, literally like mountain guides and wilderness guides and everything. And so everybody held that posture. And it was like this community of 200 people to help just hold that space with me. And where one person didn't was like, I have no idea how to help you with this. Not that they were looking for answers, but they just didn't even know how to encourage or coach.
Sure.
Then they would be like, okay, go talk to this person. And that person would be like, oh yeah, this doesn't intimidate me. Let me just sit with you. Yeah. And sometimes they had wisdom and sometimes they just had presence. And so I learned to not be afraid of the questions, and they did it as a group project. Like my growth and development was was a project of the group, as not in a bad project way, but like they weren't trying to fix me. They just took collective responsibility for me as a disciple of Jesus. And they did that for everyone else, right? So it's just phenomenal. And they taught me a lot about, their stories and journeys of deconstruction and where they were and how they learned to trust God more. So I think if we hold it individually, we're going to feel overwhelmed by different people's stories. I think, as Toby talked about, he's not the right person necessarily to walk with everybody. Right. That's true of all of us. But if we can do it as a community, then I think we can be a place where people can deconstruct and reconstruct without losing their faith.
Yeah. There's this quote in Ron McLaren's Faith After Doubt, and he says, "To my surprise, I discovered that at the heart of my own tradition, in the Bible I had been reading my whole life, and especially in the life and teachings of Jesus, Mary, Paul, James, John, etc., the fresh understanding of faith my heart was thirsty for had been waiting like a hidden spring all along." And so, I think sometimes it's that what we've been longing for is there. Yeah. And it's not necessarily attached to, the institution or the people or something like that have given us the distaste or pushed us into kind of a new way of thinking. And in community, I think is where those hidden springs are found.
Right. And other
together.
people's stories, right?
Because someone can be a guide and say, oh, but what about this? And it becomes a hidden spring that was there all along, And so community is so important to journey in those things together.
Yeah, I think the research shows that whether or not a person loses their faith in the deconstructive spaces, in the two different ones, really has to do with the community, right? So if the community says, well, for you to ask questions means you don't have faith,
right,
and they kick you out, like you're much more likely to abandon your faith because you don't have somebody to show you those springs, and you're going to end up just wandering over there. While I feel like in the research shows that a community that can hold that, then you hang on to your faith even while you find different beliefs about things or examine your beliefs and come to the same conclusion, come to different conclusions. But the community really is the key factor in whether or not people keep their faith. So if we do it alone, we're more likely to lose our faith. But but finding somebody like that group you have, that's more likely to help us endure and just not lose sight of how God is also moving in this situation, that we still are in God's story.
Yeah. I mean, think about the disciples and what they must have been thinking as a group, because most of these guys probably, and I'm sure they were used to Hebraic rhythms of faith and the temple and sacrifice and all these things. And then Jesus comes along and starts deconstructing. I mean, it's basically what he's doing. So they are a community walking through this. And you even see it a few times in Scripture where it may not say it, but you can see Jesus say something, and you can imagine them just looking at each other like, what? Like, we're going to eat with what? Who? Sinners and tax collectors? Are you kidding? And so he's like teaching them along the way, and they find these new springs or this new way, this new kingdom, which is gospel, good news, right? And so I think, maybe even our deconstruction is a discovery of good news, what the gospel really is, and at times, because, like people like Nicole, or what Toby has experienced, or what Greg is shifting from, can feel a little more legalistic. And so just like Jesus leading from a more legalistic culture into a good news kingdom, right, that's based on relationship with him, maybe that's what we can seek too, is a gospel. And you could just call it, we're looking for good news, not deconstruction, Yeah,
I mean, I think if my hope is for the people who are listening to this and the communities that are listening to this, the communities see themselves as having a vital role, not in having answers, but in having presence and patience, and at least just continuing to recenter the conversation on Jesus, right? So where's Jesus? Who is Jesus in this moment for us? What might Jesus be saying to us? Where's the example in Scripture? And we can walk away from or let all the rest of it go and find that centered set on Jesus's life in us. So as a community focused on Jesus, I mean, I don't know what we figure out or if we figure anything out, but at least we can have that unity in him, which I think is the promise on the other side of the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
That's my hope. That's my hope for the communities as we walk forward.
Yeah, and I would just say to anyone, whether you're a pastor wondering about things, or just a person, trying to frame a new paradigm of Jesus and God and faith, that you're not alone. I mean, we know there are just scores of people that have been part of church or faith, and there are scores of pastors out there asking questions. And whatever spectrum of this you're in, you're not alone. And I know that we would offer to try to help connect to communities, but I mean, whatever city it is, whatever state it is, there are communities of people that are trying to figure this out. And so to find one, and journey in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my prayer too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think the danger would be feeling that we're alone and that we can get lost in the wilderness all by ourselves. So as the African parable says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together.
Yeah. That's great. That's great.
Right. Well, thank you for being with us. We just hope that these conversations help you find the journey of deconstructing without losing your faith. Thank you for tuning in for Faithful Deconstruction. As a listener to this podcast, we wanted to make available to you a free download entitled 6 Questions of Faithfulness. They are questions that help you both honor God and the journey you're on. You are not alone, and you're not lost, even if it might feel like it. Go to Whoology.co for access to our free resources today.